Guten Abend and good evening. Madam Ambassador, Ms. Bashwati Mukherjee, Dr. Markus Farber, Mr. Furkan and Mr. Datta, dear ladies and gentlemen. As the head of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom, Wiesbaden in Germany, it is my honor to welcome you to participate in our online event today on the war in Ukraine and its implication on South Asia. The Friedrich-Naumann Foundation is a German political foundation that promotes liberal values and works in areas of good governance, rule of law, digital transformation, and free market economy. We achieve our goals by pushing for political consultancy, political dialogue, and civic education. The war in Ukraine has shattered the peace in Europe and is causing massive destruction and human suffering. NATO has called the war the greatest threat to Euro-Atlantic security in decades. And while Europe and the US have unanimously denounced the aggression, the reaction from South Asian nations may, on the surface, seem inadequate, lukewarm. And it is at this point that I want to shout out a big thank you to my colleagues in New Delhi, especially Rajat Kumar, for organizing this event, because these are exactly the questions I had when I followed the news in Germany. Why this reaction in South Asia? And we have gathered a stellar panel of senior experts from South Asia with experience in diplomatic relations, foreign policy, strategic analysis, and security issues. And I cannot wait to hear from them and, well, fill the blanks in my knowledge. But first, ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Dr. Markus Farber. Dr. Farber is a member of the Bundestag from the state of Saxony-Anhalt since 2017. He did his basic military service in Havelberg and studied political science in Potsdam and Sydney. He is a member of the Defense Committee in the Bundestag and is the FDP parliamentary group spokesperson on defense policy. In addition to politics, he's also, excuse me, one second, please. In addition to politics, he's also involved in the Ambassadors Club, the Association of Diplomats Accredited in Germany. Thank you so much, Dr. Farber, for your address. I'm sure my colleagues hope to welcome you soon in South Asia.
Thanks, Mr. Walz, for having me, and thanks to the Naumann Foundation for organizing this event and having the invitation. It's quite a troubled time in Europe, especially if you are attached to defense policies. In Germany, as I am for 5 years now, we have seen a brutal attack on a sovereign democratic state that shocked, I guess, all of us, but it certainly did not come as a surprise. We have seen an attack of Russia against the nation of Georgia in 2008. We have seen an attack of the Putin regime against Crimea, where Little Green Man appeared in 2014, and an ongoing battle in eastern Ukraine since 2014 as well. We have seen Russian intervention in Syria. And so it is no surprise that the Putin regime is using military force to prolong its political aims. What we have seen now is just a much bigger scale. In 2021, we have seen Russia amassed about 180,000 troops and equipment near the Russian-Ukrainian and Belarusian-Ukrainian borders. And despite a lot of assurances from the Russian side that these troops are just conducting exercises, the Russian army actually invaded the territory of Ukraine, a sovereign nation, on February the 24th. On our view, the Putin-led Russia is, by this means, completely unreliable, untrustworthy, and is in fact a dangerous government, not only to Ukraine, as I mentioned, to other states in the neighborhood of Russia as well. The invasion is a clear violation of the Budapest memorandum as well, that were signed by Ukraine, obviously, but also Russia, the US, and the Ukraine in 1994. And this Budapest Memorandum stated that the Russian Federation is to respect the independence and the sovereignty and existing borders of Ukraine. On behalf of the Budapest Memorandum, the Ukraine gave up its completely nuclear arsenal. And so the situation would have been different if Ukraine would have not signed this Budapest Memorandum. It would have been better armed today. So Putin and Lavrov lied to us during the last months, but also before. And we have to act in Europe, but also worldwide, on behalf of the actions we've seen from the Putin regime. This is an unprovoked illegal war, and we cannot go back to business as usual. So Germany, but also the European Union and the NATO, especially the European Union, acted on economic sanctions, and that will stay in place for a long time, I guess. And we will, as Germany, also diversify our energy imports. We will try to phase out Russian oil and gas by 2027 at least. We will reduce our dependency on Russian oil by 50% until the end of this year. We will cease all coal imports from Russia by autumn, and we will phase out Russian gas, hopefully by 2024. This will be costly, but it is also necessary, as we don't want to finance Russian wars in the neighborhood. And we, on the other side, we are also providing Ukraine the means to defend itself. And we are also strengthening our own armies. Basically, all European nations are doing this by now. We have an 100 billion investment program in the German Bundeswehr. In other countries in our neighborhood, as Austria is doubling its military spending, the Netherlands are also heavily investing, as Poland did in the past as well. So we are acting on military terms. The NATO is improving its presence on the eastern flank of the NATO, so in the Baltics, for instance. And the EU states will do a lot more. We are taking in millions of Ukrainian refugees. We have seen a big support for the Ukrainian refugees in Poland. They were very, very helpful. But nowadays, the Ukrainian refugees are also coming to Germany in great numbers. Actually, 500 meters from the German parliament, the Deutscher Bundestag, we see hundreds and hundreds of Ukrainian refugees day by day. And we are trying to relocate them to all of the bigger German cities so that Berlin doesn't get overwhelmed. The EU will also try to act on its Indo-Pacific strategy and to maintain an open and rules-based regional security architecture. And we will ask you to also support sanctions, but also support open and rules-based regional security architecture. I think there's one basic message over here. The democracies in the free countries in the world must stay together, and they are more reliable because they are democratic. Democracies have a tendency not to go to war with each other, but also to have a lesser tendency to go to war with other countries, because they are the governments in democracies have to rely on their population. And the population basically never wants a war, or even the Russian population, if they would know what is happening over there, that about 15,000 and above Russian soldiers are already dead, they will definitely not support this. So I am asking you to support the EU sanctions to de-attach to Russia and probably also to China, as they are forming a bloc by now. And to open up to Europe and the Western world so that we can face the challenges ahead of us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Farber, for this very clear address. I would now like to introduce our moderator for today, Mr. Saikat Datta. Currently, he's a founding partner of Deep Strat, a New Delhi-based think tank and strategic consultancy firm. Mr. Datta is a former award-winning journalist who has worked at the intersection of public policy, journalism, and security in a career spanning over 2 decades. He has been associated with NALCON, Asia's biggest cybersecurity conference hub, and The Dialogue, a think tank on technology and policy in India. He was the vice president and head of de-risking strategies of Reliance Global Corporate Security, specializing in counterterrorism and cybersecurity projects. He was also a consultant to the National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center, a body created under India's Information Technology Act as the designated national agencies for all cyber threats to critical information infrastructure. So that was quite a lot. Thank you, Mr. Datta, for joining us, and I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wines, and also thank you, Dr. Farber. We hear you. It was very clear, pretty unambiguous, and I'm sure that's already provoked some interesting thoughts among our panelists. We'll try and answer some of the questions that you've posed in your opening remarks. And although you have been very unambiguous in the way that you've positioned the appeal to isolate Russia and the emergence of a bloc, if you were to hang around for a bit and hear the panelists, I'm sure you will realize it's far more complex from a South Asian perspective than what it seemed. And a lot of it is because of historical reasons. Before that, I'll do a quick introduction of our panelists. I have with me Ambassador Mukherjee. She has been, she comes from the Indian Foreign Service. She's from the 1976 batch of the Indian Foreign Service and has served in several capacities with the United Nations. She's been the permanent delegate of India to UNESCO and the chief of staff to the UNHRC. The last post I was as the Indian ambassador to the Netherlands, is again someone who's very familiar not only with the UN and the UN processes and internationalism, but also with Europe. And she's also a very prominent speaker on Indo-European relations. And of course, we get to see her writing very prolifically and also on television. We also have from Bangladesh, Dr. Lailapur Yasmin. She's a professor from the University of Dhaka in the Department of International Relations. Again, someone who has written extensively, particularly on secularism in Bangladesh and on South Asian issues. Her research has involved around religion and politics, something that's quite live in South Asia, especially in India and Bangladesh to a large extent. Ethnic issues, maritime security, gender and conflict-related issues. She also offers courses on international relations, theories, nationalism and ethnicity, gender and development. And of course, Mr. Imran Furqan, he is the CEO of Trezinc. He is by training a chartered management accountant and currently serves as the CEO of Trezinc, which is a consulting company focused in the APAC region, delivering global solutions and focuses on advising companies. And as he pointed out in his opening remarks, he's somebody who's looked at disruption, he looks at geopolitical risk, advises a host of companies, and also looks at black swan economic and political events, and somebody who would be extremely involved in some of the issues that we will discuss today. So thank you very much for agreeing to be part of this. Since Ambassador Mukherjee is probably will be the first one to leave this panel, I'd request if she could start with a 2-minute opening remarks. Then I'll come to the other panelists and then we'll try to make this as interactive as possible. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Having heard carefully my German colleagues, I would first like to quote from what Henry Kissinger, who's no friend of India, wrote recently in the Washington Post about Ukraine. He said, and I quote, "Far too often the Ukrainian issue is posed as a showdown, whether Ukraine joins the East or the West. But if Ukraine is to survive and thrive, it must not be either side's outpost against the other. It should function as a bridge between them. He continued, and I quote, Ukraine has been independent for only 23 years. Not surprisingly, its leaders have not learned the art of compromise, even less of historical perspective. We should seek reconciliation, not the domination of a faction. For the West, the demonization of Vladimir Putin is not a policy. It is an alibi for the absence of one, unquote. That is not me, ladies and gentlemen. That's Henry Kissinger, no friend of India. And I am not an admirer of Henry Kissinger, but I think he has summarized it very well. We've been asked to explain perhaps the South Asian and the Indian perspective on this conflict. Let me first begin by saying that India firmly believes in rule of law and in international law and the rule-based order. India is in a very difficult neighborhood where India considers that its main strategic challenge, not just to India, but to the world order as India sees it, and India is firmly anchored with the West, with the European Union and the United States in a strategic partnership, comes from China and not from Russian Federation. India views with alarm a greatly weakened Russia, further weakened by sanctions, coming closer and closer into the embrace of the Chinese dragon. India believes that this will lead to an unequal world order where the country that will be the first to pay the price, because it's always been alone in confronting China, is India. India believes that foreign policy is based on its core critical national interests. India has only once participated in the changing of a border, an international border. That is when India in 1971, with the active assistance of the then USSR, went in with the Mukti Bahini for the liberation of what was then East Pakistan, to prevent genocide and to enable 10 million then East Pakistanis, now Bangladeshis, to return home safely and in honor. I will conclude my brief remarks by saying that just as core national interests are so important for countries like Germany and Netherlands, that they can only phase out completely dependence on Russian oil in 2027. Similarly, India is an emerging country, a democratic country with huge difficulties in its neighborhood, can only do the same over time. There is no point in asking India to do the inevitable. We are dependent on the Russian Federation for armaments and spare parts, and we are dependent because of the rising oil prices on a deal which would give us the necessary oil to fuel our economy and get it out of the pandemic-caused recession. Therefore, what is all right for Germany and Netherlands should be even more justifiable for India, because we cannot compare an emerging country which has been colonized for 180 years with the mighty giants in the West. Their perspective is absolutely correct. We don't want to be dependent. It will take us time to get out of the dependence. But our strategic partners, the EU and United States, fully understand our difficulties, and they understand that India is with the West. We will be with the West. But at the same time, we expect the West also to understand the unique dilemmas that a country like India faces. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Mukherjee. I'm very conscious of the fact that, even in regional, we tend to overcome or crowd out voices from other parts of South Asia. But I'll just seek a quick privilege as a moderator and point out that history for us from South Asia, and particularly from a country like India, is very, very different from the perspective that you gave. And as Ambassador Mukherjee pointed out, Russians have proved to be an all-weather ally for many years. Also, we see a stark difference when there are issues of concern, say from an Indian strategic point of view, and perhaps, and I do not say that I speak on behalf of my colleagues from Sri Lanka or Bangladesh at all, but perhaps from a South Asian context, that whenever threats, like for example, China, and we have seen, we are lucky enough to be in a neighborhood where we have China on one side and Pakistan on the other. And in such a lucky neighborhood, we have seen that when it comes to dealing with Pakistan, China, and Afghanistan, the West employs a very different perspective. when it comes to threats to us, but has a completely different perspective when it comes to dealing with threats to themselves. And this duality is something that we always try to understand and negotiate with. And with that, I'll request Professor Yasmin from Bangladesh to come in and share her views. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me in such a prestigious gathering. From Bangladesh, we have a clear sort of respect for rules-based international order, as we have seen, especially in terms of resolving our maritime boundary issue, how rules-based international order has helped us out to resolve this issue with India on one side and Myanmar on the other side. So there is no doubt that Bangladesh respects international law and other international arrangements. As Madam Ambassador has previously pointed out, that this issue is quite complex for South Asia. We cannot see any black and white manner. There are substantially gray areas, something that other parts of the world, especially Europe and the concept of the West, they have to sort of try to understand, because it is no longer a post-Second World War era, number one. Number two, that we are not only independent, that we have charted out a huge path. Bangladesh, for example, was dependent on foreign aid hugely. Now, Bangladesh's aid dependency is only 1%, and in 50 years of time, Bangladesh has achieved so much in terms of Human Development Index, in terms of women's empowerment, in terms of developing its economy with its own resources, in terms of supplying online labor forces worldwide. India is number one, Bangladesh is number two. And then in terms of how we managed COVID during the entire from 2020, and the number of death, the number of infection rate, number of vaccination, in all of those areas, Bangladesh is so much ahead of many of the nations of the world. So Bangladesh treats this matter like there are two different narratives. At one hand, there are two complex issues, complex historical issues, as Madam Ambassador has pointed out. In 1971, the support that Bangladesh received, univocal, unhesitating support that Bangladesh had received from India and Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, that is something that is imprinted in our memory. I am a post-1971 generation, but I cannot get past 1971. Same for most majority of our country people. But then there is another area of complex interdependence, that world economy is connected in such a manner that we cannot ignore the realities, how anything happening in any part of the world can affect us here in Bangladesh. It is geographically, the size is small, but Bangladesh hosts about 170 million people. It is a big market for a number of countries, and that is why in the past about 10 years or so, you will see how great powers are flocking here. So with Russia, we not only have historical connection, historical relationship, but at the same time, we have defense cooperation, our only nuclear power plant that is being built by Russia. And there are many other ways, there are sort of historical connection, cultural connection. Having said that, there is no way that we support any aggression to another country, but in terms of diplomatically, we do not support that. But having said that, what happened at United Nations General Assembly is that you can see that why certain countries we refrained, abstained from taking up a stance. And I'd like to point out, and Madam Secretary would be able to sort of corroborate with me, that former Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, he famously pointed out, neutrality does not mean disrespecting international law. Neutrality does mean a country being able to pursue its own path in international politics. So that is how I believe that time has come, that there is a rise of a number of countries like Bangladesh and other countries. In fact, Bangladesh is often seen as an emerging middle power, or in fact a middle power in terms of its entrepreneurship and the skills that we have developed over the years in fighting climate change and other issues. So Bangladesh does matter in international politics, and that is why I believe you are here and seeking sort of our opinions at the public opinion level, yes, there are, this dichotomy in giving a direct verdict against any country. But at the same time, from the perspective of international law, there's no doubt that sovereignty of a country is sacrosanct. It cannot be broken. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Yasmin. That was excellent. I'll now move on to our next panelist, Imran. And something that Imran, when we were discussing before this conversation started, you said something very interesting about how Sri Lanka has had a very close relationship with China, and yet now you're seeing moving away from China because of risks that could pose, especially for supply chain, etc., so on and so forth. And one issue that Ambassador Mukherjee also pointed out is that a fading Russia or an isolated Russia can move further into the Chinese sort of sphere of influence. And maybe we could see a Cold War 2.0 if it's not started already. So from your perspective and also from an APAC region, because your company deals in that, what do you see? How does this pan out for you?
Yeah, I think very quickly to talk about the situation in terms of historical ties with Russia and Sri Lanka, right? The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov speaks Sinhalese, so you can understand how deep that ties are, because his first posting as a foreign career diplomat was in Colombo in the 1970s, where we were following a very pro-Russia and political and economic policy. So he has very fond memories of his posting in Sri Lanka, right? So our diplomatic ties with Russia go to 1957. Just after independence, we had very Western-oriented economic and political philosophy. Then in 1956, you saw SWRT Bandaranaike become the prime minister. He, adopted a completely different kind of perspective, and he opened up to ties with the USSR, as it was known. Ties have been ongoing for a very long time. As you can imagine, Russia has helped Sri Lanka in many ways, particularly politically at the UN Security Council to deal with, vetoing resolutions against the government as it has come up, particularly at the end of the war. And then in addition to that, there has been economic cooperation as well, particularly during the USSR's time, in terms of, setting up manufacturing plants. A lot of Sri Lankan public servants had got scholarships to Russian universities. They have very fond memories of that period. And in addition to that, I think now, of course, our economic ties are mainly with the West, our biggest export markets. So that complicates the situation, right? Our biggest export markets are the US and the EU. Right, and Russia, we mainly export things like tea, and then we import, things like fertilizer. So the economic relationship is not as great as it once was with the USSR, but it's ongoing. But at the same time, we also have a very good relationship with Ukraine. I know that's where it's complicated as well. We were one of the first countries to recognize Ukraine in 1992. Ukrainian weapons have found itself, within armed forces during the war as well. Post-COVID tourism boom, surprisingly, you had the Western and Indian and Chinese tourists replaced in the post-COVID revival by Russia. Russian tourists were number one, which is very surprising after many years, and Ukrainian tourists were number 5. So, I mean, you can imagine the complex situation Sri Lanka finds itself. In addition to that, obviously, the relationship with China. China is by far the biggest investor into Sri Lanka in terms of government-to-government investment, and it's one of our biggest import markets as well. So economically, it has been very supportive of the current regime, and also the Sri Lanka in the last 17 or so years, particularly, and then obviously our relationship with India is deep and very very long-standing. I think that's something that people forget a lot. But now I think the relationship, again, we have an economic crisis that Sri Lanka is going through. You may have read about it. And in this crisis, I think particularly India has come in the last few months a lot more than even China has. And with economic packages and so on. So I think India's views are being taken seriously. So it's a very complicated situation. But also we must not forget that we are a small island nation that needs to also worry about sovereignty and rules-based international order. There is this meme that is going along. It's also a bit of a joke where Jawaharlal Nehru is supposed to have shown the map of India, and when you show the map of India, you can see the island of Sri Lanka as well, to Stalin. And Stalin is supposed to have asked, what is that little dot at the end? And he had said, well, that is Ceylon, as it was then called a separate country. And he had asked, well, why? So the mentality of having, respecting sovereign borders is very, very important for a small island nation like Sri Lanka. We understand that, but at the same time, very, very complex relationships are ongoing as well. Just to add something about Bangladesh, it's funny because in 1971, during the the independence war, even though the Bandaranaike regime was very close to the Gandhi family in India, and the relationship between India and Sri Lanka are very strong, we didn't really join the boycott of particularly the air, air services because we felt, the government felt, on a principle note, that is an internal problem of East Pakistan. It's weird in a way when you look at it today, but we actually, Pakistani jets went through Colombo, bypassing India, and were involved, in the Bangladesh war, because it was considered a principle that we were a small island nation and we respect existing borders. It's a weird concoction today when you look at it, because we have very good relationship with Bangladesh, and Bangladesh has assisted us as well. But I think in the past there was a very respect for a lot of principle-based international order. So we're in a complicated situation. Nothing is very easy. And just to allude to the other point you made about the rest of Asia, I think everybody is having their own, views, simply driven by either historical ties or economic ties. But on a general note, I think the public is very concerned about the war, sad about it. But I think individual governments are responding depending on their historical and current economic and other circumstances.
Thank you so much, Imran. As I hear these opening remarks, I'm reminded of a term that we hear a lot in India, where we point out that there are good terrorists and there are bad terrorists, because anybody who's aligned to the West principles suddenly becomes a good terrorist, and then moment they go against the West, they become bad terrorists. But for us in India, we are constantly dealing with terrorists, because so now, if I were to borrow that term, there are good invasions and bad invasions. So when the West invades a country, that's certainly a good invasion. When Russia invades a country, that's a bad invasion. When China walks into what is Indian territory, again, nobody seems to be really very much bothered. And yet we heard an MP talk about the China bloc and the rising bloc. So I wanted to bring you in, Ambassador Mukherjee. This constant dichotomy, aligned with the real politic, like we also heard the MP speak about how they will reduce their dependence on Russian oil and gas, but not immediately, and they have a roadmap till 2027. For all you know, that could also change, but they want other countries to immediately follow certain kind of sanctions and bans. How do you view these dichotomies and real politics?
I view them as perfectly natural and normal from EU and German perspective, because naturally they would expect the maximum from a close strategic ally like India. But at the same time, regardless of public posturing by the European Union, by Germany, who's a very close partner of India, they understand fully that it is not possible for a huge giant like the German economy to get out of this dependence before 2027. It is not possible for India. Moreover, there is one fundamental flaw in the premise that that, for instance, Germany will phase it out by 2027. It implies that the present conflict and sanctions against Russia will continue till 2027. If they continue till 2027, Russia will become a pygmy. That's extremely dangerous for a country that has a huge nuclear arsenal, that has close history and geography linked with the West on one hand and with the East on the other. And the well-being of the Russian people are as much in the interest of South Asia as it is to the West. which is why I quoted Henry Kissinger to say that the demonization of Vladimir Putin should not result in the victimization of a great nation, a culture, and a civilization in perpetuity. That's my first problem. The second is the fact that our preoccupation, as you would know, coming from this region, is that whether they say it or they don't say it, their primary focus has shifted from China to Russia, which means that what India had been working for, the Quad, the Indo-Pacific, the navies doing joint patrolling, at some point even military and naval bases, we were prepared for that. We were actually moving into an alliance with the West. We have already moved. We can't talk about non-alignment anymore. And non-alignment again was born out of the weak economic and political situation we were immediately after independence. Today we can be allied. We are allied. But our preoccupation is that our principal strategic partners have shifted their focus inexorably from China to Russia. They may say whatever they like. They may talk about an alliance. But I think that they fail to appreciate the way India does, that the entire Ukraine crisis has really benefited the People's Republic of China. Why do I say that? Because China is in a situation where it can bail out Russia. China is being telephoned by Joe Biden. And what did Xi Jinping tell Joe Biden? He said, there are two important Chinese things. The most important is, if you tie a collar around the neck of the tiger, you must take it off yourself. That was not a friendly remark. That was an important reminder to the West that Ukraine and going after Russia is to the enormous benefit of China, because it will embolden China. Now, the West would tell you that no, Ambassador Mukherjee is wrong. The Chinese are uneasily watching how the sanctions weaken Russia. Fair enough. When they will go into Taiwan, they will do it differently. But make no mistake about it, they will have no hesitation in having a military adventure against India in the Himalayas the moment the weather improves further. And when that happens, let me assure you, the Indian Army and our armed forces will be alone facing the Chinese. Why? Because our strategic partners have let themselves get diverted. So if they tell us about Russia, I tell to them through you, please, the greatest threat to the rule-based order, to the world order in which we are all deep linked, in which India is firmly anchored with the West, comes from China. When you weaken a giant so that it collapses,
we
it is
completely
more
appreciate
dangerous.
that.
It is more
Ambassador
dangerous.
Mukherjee, since you will be leaving, there are a few questions, and this is a
I'll
good
be
time
happy
to also.
to answer me. I'll try and answer it in 2 minutes.
Yes, I'll just quickly answer those questions, and it's a good time to remember that there is a Q&A. If you look at the Zoom screen, and you can post your questions.
I don't want to fiddle around too much with my screen. So if you
yes, no, I'm not talking to you, ma'am. I'm talking to the audience. To the audience, that you can post your questions, and we'll try and take them. But I'll take a couple of questions now before Ambassador Mukherjee leaves. So there is an part question, part opinion, where there is a person who says that, Ambassador Mukherjee, I fully agree and understand that South Asian countries face challenges that are in no way comparable to those in Europe, and must therefore consider different approaches to Russia. And the Europeans are mainly unaware of these challenges. However, I am afraid that history might repeat itself, and the only thing that Russia wants, as always did, is to gain the upper hand and dominate South Asia, and especially India. Do you think that's a fair point?
I think it is extremely unfair. I would like to explain to whoever has asked this question that they should read up history. I'm a historian by discipline. The Russians first repelled Napoleon, and then in the Battle of Leningrad, they took 1 million dead. The Russians have never been afraid of losses on the ground. That's another big problem that NATO has. They call it body bags in the United States. There has never been a problem for Russia. So whether you say that 7,000 Russians have died in Ukraine or 14,000, please understand 1.5 billion men died in the battle for Leningrad, which left the Russian Federation economy run by Russian women for the first 20 years after 1947. So that's the first thing I would say. Secondly, where has Russia ever threatened South Asia? Not at all. I would say the Russians helped India by saying "niet" 7 times in the Security Council when the Americans wanted to condemn our help to prevent genocide. And when the 7th Fleet was sent to the Indian Ocean to vaporize my hometown, Kolkata, the Russians told us, finish your work, we give you a timeline. We did it 5 days ahead. We never went inside Dhaka. We never behaved like an occupier. That's something the Russians should understand. We did everything with the Mukti Bahini. So the crucial mistake that Russia has committed in Ukraine is that if they had a security problem because NATO, for whatever reason, was pulling their tail and talking about NATO membership for Ukraine, they should have known when to stop. A military operation, if it is limited, has limited fallout on the country concerned and on everyone else. When it goes on for too long, it has consequences which, in the context of a country which was a huge power, a superpower, and has an awesome military nuclear arsenal, is a threat to international peace and security. Therefore, there is no point in talking about sanctions going on to 2027. There has to be a negotiated end to the conflict, and the sanctions have to be eased off so that Russia can once again be part of a globalized world where all of us who are connected also don't have crippling losses in our economy. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much, ma'am, and thank you for being with us. I'll now move on to our other panelists, and I'll come to you, Professor Yasmin. There's a question. I'll start with a question that has been posed by one of our, from somebody from the audience. Is that, I mean, both Imran and you have spoken about Russia's historical support to the respective countries, our deep relations with South Asia, etc. But however, the question is, was this because of Russia's generosity, or this was basically a move to a counter move for the old, I mean, erstwhile Soviet Union to counter US and Western influence in South Asia? Professor Yasmin, and then I'll pose the same to Imran. You're on mute.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yes, I've read that just a while back. Yes, it's a very interesting question because in international politics, there is no altruism, right? No country helps out another country because they want to do so. They want to be like a great human country. That doesn't happen in international relations, and that the basic of this was laid out in a number of theories, Thomas Hobbes and other theories who talked about that international politics is nothing but anarchy. There is no supranational authority that can make one country to do something or not to do something, as we can see right now panning out once again. So it was not on the basis of altruism that Bangladesh certainly understands. But the point remains, in your times of crisis, who are the countries that has given you unwavering support? So that historical reason is something that one must have to acknowledge from a Western perspective. And then once again, when we talk about the Rohingya crisis that right now we are experiencing, look at all the nations of the world, including our good friend, good neighbor, India. All of them, they have given unwavering support to Myanmar. Yes, United States of America has placed sanctions recently, but that has driven Myanmar to North Korea. So we have multifaceted challenges. Having said that, please note that Bangladesh has a strong relationship, both defense, strategic and other type of relationship in terms of Bangladeshi students going to study in Western countries. So we have a robust relationship with EU countries, robust relationship with America, robust relationship with UK. We are having periodically bilateral trade talk, defense talk, strategic talk. So all of those are going on. But in this case, you have to understand that when we are talking about history, history gives us a different sort of a lesson. And on Rohingya issue, our biggest concern is that with the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding there, whether that would divert attention from Bangladesh to Ukraine. So that is why perhaps you can explain, we can explain Bangladesh's UNGA, vote, the second vote in UNGA, because on humanitarian issue, Bangladesh is with all the countries of the world, and of course, Bangladesh at the state level, it does not disregard the plight of the Ukrainian people, because we have gone through that in 1971. We are once again hosting one of the largest groups of refugees from Myanmar. So this is an issue that has, as at the beginning, all three of us, I guess we have said, it's a complex, interconnected issue for us.
Professor Yasmin, I'm also tempted to ask you this question. I don't know whether consciously or unconsciously you haven't mentioned China at all in this mix, but we have heard speakers talk about how crippling Russia at this stage will drive them further into the Chinese sphere of influence. And China, of course, is a major player even for Bangladesh and cannot be avoided. So how do you see China and the Chinese role panning out because of this conflict?
First of all, it's not that I deliberately avoided it, but it did not come in the sort of in the deliberations that and the questions that were asked. That yes, China is a major player, and one must have to understand that with this crisis unfolding, it will only strengthen the countries that can reap the benefit of it mostly. So before when this issue was unfolding, I believe that there should have been sort of uniformed considerations given to what was the state of the world order. Say the world order was declining for quite some time. The West-led world order, it was declining. There was no responsible power taking, showing the way, disregard to international law that was going on, as Madam Ambassador previously pointed out, that in other areas, the strategic continuity of Western countries, that was not there, that was not seen. So that is the question that has surfaced in Bangladesh to a large extent. When it comes to China-Bangladesh relationship, do remember that China is another country. From 1975 onward, we do have a strong bilateral relationship that fanned out in strategic area, defense area, economic, in the area of economic development. When Bangladesh needed money to build its infrastructure, its IMF, World Bank, or any other Western countries, they did not come to our aid. So it was the Chinese money. And I'm not bringing the issue of debt trap here yet. If there are further questions, then I'll bring out, because there are both sides of the coin. And my Sri Lankan colleague is here, and Chatham House has and recently Carnegie Endowment, they have also published reports on how Sri Lanka's debt trap has is not entirely driven by Chinese debt trap, Sri Lanka's debt problem. So there are facts and figures. So we need to be careful when we are talking about all those issues. And I'll end it here by saying just one thing, that our Honorable Prime Minister in the WEF forum in 2019, she unequivocally stated that Bangladesh deals with each of the projects with China or any other countries of the world on its value, on its merit, and by sort of judging what will be the consequences. And that is why you would see, in terms of our port diplomacy, no one country is building ports here. We have divided it into several partners. So we are doing it from that particular perspective, and that is why China is one of our biggest partner. But remember, we receive most FDI from America and most loans and grants from Japan. So to say that China is the biggest development partner would be somewhat a misrepresentation of the fact, because our facts and figures on the ground, it says otherwise.
Thank you so much, Professor Yasmin. Imran, I'll come to you, but what I'm hearing from her and Ambassador Mukherjee is there's a lot of real politics that seems to be coming up to the surface. So what you, with the same questions that I posed to her.
Yeah, I think I agree. There is really no country that helps somebody else without something in return that they expect, right? This is throughout human history, and then that's completely fine. The reason why Sri Lanka opened up to Russia in 1956 is because the government at the time, was moving towards a more nationalistic tone, and therefore the West was concerned. We saw what was happening in Suez and stuff like that. So, it was felt that we needed to move to this great partner that might, not be so critical, might support us in the UN security. We were a small country, right? We are not a permanent member of the Security Council, and Russia and lately China have been very supportive, very consistently supportive in that respect. I think everybody understands this trade-off that you do. What Sri Lanka has been great at until recently was to be able to manage this trade-off, right? So we almost always was trading very much, with the West in terms of our economy, but we were also very good with Russia. China was not really much involved with Sri Lanka except in the 1950s and 60s. Then, the relationship kind of went off. And then when the war ended, they came back very strongly because they felt that was a partnership. And also the government at the time was again a nationalistic government. The West was not very favorable to them. So they naturally looked at a partner that they can work with. So I think throughout human history, governments, everybody looks at what sort of relationship they have. And they look at the trade-offs. So this is, as Professor Rasmus said, it's a normal thing, and we should expect that. And anything is, if you are able to manage that relationship, that I think is a critical aspect of anything. I think you can still get a lot from all our partners. But the problem is when partners ask you to choose. I mean, that is a situation where I think a lot of countries don't like to be put in because, they'd like to maintain relationships with multiple countries, particularly if they don't, demand. Russia hasn't got really very involved much in Sri Lanka's affairs, internal affairs, unlike, say, for example, say India has, and also, West in terms of, human rights issues and so on. Russia has really not bothered about the domestic situation in Sri Lanka that much. They've had cultural exchanges, they've had economic exchanges, obviously a lot of training for our personnel, military training and so on. So I think because of the physical distance, I think proximity also plays a big part. So we are very close to India, so naturally India will be concerned about what's happening in their neighborhood. We are relatively close to China as well. So obviously, so therefore there will be relationship. And if you look at the how each country looks at it, right? For China, Sri Lanka's strategic location is its most valuable asset, right? China is not interested in our vote at the General Assembly, or I doubt, nor is it, they look at our strategic location. We are in the middle of the shipping lines between, say, the Middle East and Southeast Asia. We're just close to India. We are an island nation. Our exclusive economic zone goes well deep into the ocean, as well as in addition to, so if you take Bangladesh, for example, they have a limited coastline, but we are all coast, right? And therefore we are, if you look at it, our time zones are also very strategic. So I think if everybody appreciates how it works, I think the trade-offs can be managed. But Sri Lanka is in an economic crisis at the moment, a self-created economic crisis. And I do agree with Professor Yasmin that the debt trap that we talk about is also bad self-management, right? We did not understand how to see, when you take a loan from the IMF or World Bank, you also get technical assistance in how to manage the projects. And they actually look at it, and they will even, take you to task. But when the Chinese money came, it came with no strings attached. So therefore, that also meant that the allocation, the management, the future business model was a problem. And I think that is now changing. Why even China is beginning to understand that lending out money, for bad projects is neither, good for them, nor is it good for the recipient country. So I think the relationship is changing. But I think there is an appreciation, particularly in smaller countries and across South Asia, that historical ties are very, very critical. And that those ties were based on everybody's strategic requirement at a particular time, right? So I think that appreciation is there, at least among the decision makers. But the difference I see going forward, which could be really bad for Russia at this moment, is this is the first real invasion in the social media age. Yeah, we had Georgia in 2008, but social media was just taking off at the time. So a lot of young people actually look at what's going on, and they are forming an opinion that is not so favorable for Russia, right? Because the older generation is very much set in its ways. It understands the deep historical relationship with Russia, the strategic importance, so on. But for the younger generation, that is not important. What they see in front of them, the propaganda or otherwise, from different parts of the world, is impacting them. And when they become leaders in the next 15, 20, 30 years, I think the view of Russia will change, irrespective of what the socio-economic, because you are conditioned by your mindset. So today's political leaders in Sri Lanka are conditioned by the mindset of when they were growing up, right? Where Russia was by far, I think, a huge superpower, very helpful. But I think the future generation of leaders will look at it a little differently in going forward. So I think that's something we don't appreciate that much.
But I'm also hearing this. So what is the economic fallout of the Russia-Ukraine war on South Asia, especially India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh? To you, Imran. To you, Imran.
Yeah, let me start off first. I think for us, our trade with Russia was not very significant. Obviously, we were exporting some tea to them, and we were getting down some fertilizer and some machinery. Military equipment wise, yes, but the war has ended 13 years ago, so it's not as critical as it once was. But the indirect impact is where the problem is, right? We are suffering a foreign exchange crisis because we printed way too much money during the COVID situation, and then tourism was affected as well. So I think those two are why we are in a foreign exchange crisis, and we have borrowed extensively during the previous years that we cannot sustain. Now, the indirect impact is where our biggest import cost is fuel. We don't have any fuel of our own. So now oil prices have taken off exponentially when we are facing a foreign exchange crisis. So you can imagine today in Sri Lanka, we have 13-hour, they have 13-hour power cuts, which is something we've never had before, because we were one of the few South Asian countries that had power for 24 hours continuously. And this is something and this has come about because price, oil has gone up exponentially, and we are also facing a price cut. In addition, there are other implications as well, right? Freight costs have gone exponentially high as well, but that is a pre-COVID, COVID situation that has got out of control. And we also export a lot of our apparel and as Bangladesh does, and so many other things via sea, right? I think we are switching to air also, but now I think sea is a big problem. And now the other day I saw Sri Lankan Airlines had stopped with a direct flight from Moscow. And one of the things that we had was we have a direct flight flights between Moscow and Colombo, which helped to increase the Russian tourists, right? And the reason why Sri Lankan Airlines has stopped is not because we have closed our airspace to Russian aircraft. We will not do that, and we are flying over Russia as well. It's because the insurance costs from airline leasing companies has got prohibitively expensive that you cannot service it anymore. So the indirect impact here is where I think we are getting hit a lot more, right? Because Western sanctions start impacting other service providers that impact us. So I think the economic situation impact is very severe for us. I think this could really tip us into default. I mean, we were in very bad situation before because of mismanagement, but I think we're going to this might actually tip, if it continues like this, almost tip us to a default, and we might go to the IMF, but I think we are getting there. So I think the indirect impacts have been very, very severe for Sri Lanka.
Professor Yasmin, I'm also hearing this, that based on this discussion, that here in South Asia, as we all agree, it's a far more complex issue. There is the strategic relationship, Russia-West, there is the economic relationship. So as far as the economic relationship is concerned, I think South Asia is now more or less closer to the West than with Russia, although China is also a factor, and there is a strong economic relationship. We can debate whether it's a good one or a bad one, but there is a strong relationship with China. And therefore, while there won't be a direct impact economically, whatever happens vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis our trade relations and economic relations with the West is primarily the prism that will decide our views on the Russia-Ukraine war. But however, where the strategic relationship is concerned, and here there is a question that has been posed to us, is that but shouldn't we condemn Russian atrocities in Ukraine? And I think nobody really debates that any atrocities anywhere should be condemned. And both of you have spoken about the international order and how we respect it. But the strategic relationship is a little more complex than the economic one, because we've had a long relationship with the erstwhile Soviet and Russia, which we cannot ignore. So where do you think will this pan out?
Thank you. Your question itself is a very complex one. In fact, I'll first sort of echo one point with Mr. Furqan, that here in Bangladesh as well, our older generation who have studied in Moscow and in different educational institutions, and the way their solidarity and the way they are in various places in decision-making process. So they have a huge role to play in shaping the discourse about Russia. Having said that, yes, invasion is condemned anywhere and everywhere. That Bangladesh has consistently, it has done. Then in terms of economic relationship, in fact, our biggest trading partners over, in Asia, Japan, where we have actually we export the most products. And then in the West, European Union, UK, United States of America, and Australia, New Zealand. So we have to be careful about this, maintaining this channel of economic cooperation steady as well. So economic relationship and trade strategic relationship, often they are sort of convoluted together in a manner that limits a state to have strategic autonomy. So that is where I think Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, countries like us, we need to really think that how do we sort of come to answer this particular area. Because our RMG, it mostly goes to America, European Union, and other Western countries. So this is an area that we need to really have a informed discussion inside the country. Foreign policy is only the extension of domestic consensus. So we need to have that kind of discussion here. At the same time, with Russia, we have a sort of strategic relationship. But as Mr. Furqan said, that the impact of the sanction on Bangladesh is rather indirect than being direct. Once again, and that is why perhaps some of the South Asian countries, they have remained outside of this. They wanted to have this strategic autonomy in terms of taking decision. Nonetheless, we undoubtedly, unhesitatingly, we condemn any kind of invasion, because healthy respect for international law to rules-based order is a key for survival for countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and other many other countries.
Absolutely.
So that is where I would unequivocally state that. But this is actually that phase that with economic sanction, when as we have heard at the beginning, that Germany's dependence is still 30%. Altogether, EU's dependence on Russian oil is 25%. Even if they are considering of phasing out, I think that is a far-fetched plan. So what Bangladeshis or Sri Lankans or other countries want to see a strategic continuity and continuity of economic sanction in a comprehensive manner, so that it can be sellable to the other countries who are yet to take such a decision. So I think this continuity is something that we are looking at. So I think that is why we need to really come on board.
So the takeaway from your comments is strategic autonomy. And I
just
just had 3 minutes.
And strategic continuity.
Continuity as well as autonomy, as well as strategic autonomy. So I have three minutes left. So Imran, if you could also include your concluding remarks.
Yeah, so two things. Sanctions done for a long term actually work, right? I'll give you an example of the sanctions that against Iran, right? So Sri Lanka used to be a big partner, a trading partner with Iran, very close relationships again as before. We used to import a lot of crude from Iran, and our refinery was actually set up to refine light sweet crude from Iran, and Iran supported us initially as well. But when the economic sanctions have happened, the trade with Iran has basically dried up. We don't import any more oil from Iran because we don't want our banking channels exposed to sanctions, right? And we are a very small country, we can't afford to take those sanctions. It's where, and they used to buy tea from us, and now they can't pay for their tea for a long time. So finally, they've come to some agreement of a barter trade, right, where you, for the historical debts of the Iranian oil imports, we're supposed to pay tea, but that also has kind of got so. For small countries or vulnerable countries, economic sanctions can sort of work, but I think it's not done. I mean, we don't want what we like to do. Right? It's been forced on us, and we are aware of the fact that it's been forced on us. I think, yeah, it's also about the need to be consistent, right? With the Iranian sanctions, they were long-lasting. They were, put in place across the world, and Iran has very few, very big friends that can kind of help them. Just to add one more, and I'll finish. I think how this will pan out will be a couple of things, right? Number one will be how China comes in, and for example, the banking system that China has, similar to SWIFT. If that starts replacing some of the trade, then I think countries will be much more comfortable in sort of bypassing the sanctions. But as long as SWIFT is the global banking, this thing, I don't think any of the countries would want to take a risk, because it's simply not worth it. The Chinese, either the Russian payment system or the Chinese payment system will not work. And number two is we are biggest trading partners in terms of exports are the US and the EU, and they have that adds pressure. While we like to be with China, China is not importing much from Sri Lanka. So, I mean, obviously, while it's giving loans, at some point, if it comes to the crunch, we will be aware of where we can export to as well.
Sorry,
so I think, yeah.
I'm completely out of time. So just to conclude from whatever we've heard, South Asia will look at its interests first. It does believe in the international rules order, but there are strategic reasons why it will not go out and condemn, because there are implications, so on and so forth. China will remain a big factor, as will our trade relations with the West and the United States as we can. And with that, I'll request Dr. Klein to come in and take over the proceedings. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also from my side, I think the event has shown very clearly that the more verbal exchange we have, the better it is to understand our mutual interests and perspectives. That refers, of course, to state levels as well as to non-state levels. It concerns politics as well as diplomacy, security policy, economies, and others within, of course, South Asia, but also beyond South Asia, bilaterally as well as multilaterally. In any case, Friedrich-Naumann Foundation will in Germany, in South Asia and elsewhere help to ensure that actors come together as today in order to exchange ideas and different perspectives in order to help to find good approaches to conflict management and post-conflict rehabilitation. We hope that that is quite soon the case. And however, our support and our solidarity goes out to the courageous people of Ukraine who are holding up, from our perspective, the torch of freedom and defend universal values for all of us, even with their own lives. All dear panelists, Honorable Ambassador Mukherjee, dear Professor Dr. Lailufa Yasmin, Mr. Imran Furkan, Honorable Member of Parliament, Dr. Markus Farber, and of course, our moderator, Saika Datta. Thank you very much for your insights, for the comments, and for the exchange. We also would like to express our appreciation to all of you who attended this discussion. And we will definitely continue to reflect on different South Asian perspectives, also regarding this war situation in Ukraine. I offer also my sincere thanks to all of our guests who took out this quite late time to attend our seminar. Thanks to our friends in the foundation in Hesse and Rhineland-Palatinate, especially the head there, Mr. Patrick Walz. Thanks to our team at the regional office here in Delhi, especially Mr. Rajat Kumar and Manjari Mishra for the organization of this event. Dear colleagues, dear friends and listeners, please, for further activities, check our social media channels. Thank you again to all of you for the discussion. I wish you all the best and do have a very good night, all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well. Gute Nacht.